Gels get quite a bad press amongst endurance cyclists, well, ultra-endurance cyclists, bike packers, road access and that type of thing. But physiologically, they must be optimum for rides of a certain length because they're designed specifically to help endurance athletes perform at an optimal level. So are they optimum for longer events? And if not, why not? And if not, how long is the event that they are optimal for, or how long is the longest event that they are optimal for? I'm not going to consider fat adaptation at this stage, although there are some arguments for trying to become fat adapted and fuel yourself on fats. It's not been proven scientifically, and it's quite a complicated process. So I'm just going to stick with the conventional thinking and discuss gels and fueling in a more conventional sense. There are a few negatives about gels. Some of them are real negatives, like they're hard on your stomach if you have a lot of them, so fueling yourself over 3 or 4 days with just gels is not really going to be practical for most people, but fueling yourself for 1 day might be practical. They aren't readily available in normal shops, so if you're self-supported, you can only use what you can carry, which is a bit of a negative because they are quite heavy as well because they're liquid. Carrying enough for a multi-day event isn't really practical because they weigh quite a lot and they take up a certain amount of space. They're purely carbohydrate, so it's questionable whether they're a healthy alternative or they provide all the macronutrients that you need for longer multi-day events. It might be that you need to take some protein in a multi-day event, and taking in some fat could also be helpful. So this also feeds the argument that they might be good for shorter events, but maybe not for longer events. They're expensive, so it costs quite a lot of money compared to eating more normal foods. We have the impression that they're just processed foods, but most of the stuff that people eat in longer endurance events are processed foods. So I'm not really strong on that argument. And most of the top manufacturers nowadays are using quite healthy ingredients. So I think the health aspect of it is questionable for such a short period of time, even if it was a 2 or 3 week event. And in this sort of grassroots sort of sports, it's trendy to rebel. But really what we want to do is look for what's the optimal thing to do and then consider our ethics separately perhaps. Because if it's not the optimal thing to do, you don't really need to worry about the ethics. They'll just take care of themselves. In terms of performance in endurance events, taking in a lot of carbohydrate, 60 to 90 grams an hour, has been shown to be a good idea. And also it's been shown that it doesn't really matter how you take those carbohydrates in. Your body's not bothered whether you're taking a gel, a donut, a loaf of bread or a bag of sugar. The thing that does come into play is whether your stomach can deal with those things. And obviously you can train yourself to deal with different types of things, just like you can train your body to perform more effectively and more efficiently. You can train your gut to absorb and digest different types of foods. And in shorter events where you can actually carry enough gels or energy bars or drink mix to fuel yourself for the entire event, it makes a lot of sense to use them because they're conveniently packaged, they're easy to eat, you just squeeze one into your mouth, you don't have to chew on it or anything like that. And caffeine gels are also incredibly effective when you get tired. So even in longer events, it might be worth carrying a few caffeine gels because you might need a boost or get yourself through a bad patch. So if you're working on 60 grams an hour and you're doing a 10-hour event or say a 12-hour event, that's 24 gels. If you've got a bag, you can carry that many gels and you can train yourself to be able to use gels purely for that type of event. You might not want to do it that way, it might not be best for you, but it's certainly possible and physiologically it could be optimal. Having said that, 24 gels of 30 grams of carbohydrate each weighs about 1.8 kilos, so that's quite a lot of weight that you're adding to your bike. But moving on to longer events, you can't carry enough gels. You can't really buy gels in normal shops, so it's impractical to use just gels to fuel yourself in a multi-day event, even if you could stomach it. And it's questionable whether you could stomach it for several days. But doing a few calculations, I did a 200-kilometer ride the other day, a couple of days ago, and it took me 10 hours and my magic computer told me I'd used 4,000 calories. I'm using a power meter, so it should be fairly accurate. And I ate 20 gels in the 10 hours, which is okay for me. I can easily stomach that. And on top of that, I had some drink mix, and that came to about 3,000 calories. So I was 1,000 calories in deficit in 10 hours. So using an example of something fairly tangible, like Paris-Brest-Paris is 1,200 kilometers. And to do it in the 90 hours, you have to do 300 kilometers a day. So that's 1.5 times what I did, so 6,000 calories per day. So to get 6,000 calories from gels, you'd need 50 gels. So you need to be eating 50 gels a day. Well, that's a hell of a lot, isn't it? And that's not really going to work. But also bearing in mind that this 60 grams of carbs that I was eating on my 200-kilometre ride isn't enough energy for the actual ride. You know, I've used more energy than I took in. And you probably wouldn't want to be doing that in a multi-day event. It's okay for a day or a couple of days. It's okay to lose a bit of weight. But you don't want to be in energy deficit for longer events. If you're doing a 3-week event, you obviously don't want to be in a significant energy deficit at the end. It's okay to lose a bit of weight, perhaps, if you've got a bit of weight to lose, but you don't want to be losing a lot. So you don't want to be losing 1,000 calories a day. So you've got to eat more than 60 grams of carbs per day, or you've got to eat 60 grams of carbs today, plus some fat and plus some protein. And as a consequence, we can probably say that eating a mixture of foods that are primarily carbohydrates but have a mixture of fat and protein in them is a better way to go, and an easier way to go, and a much more practical way to go than just trying to use pure carbohydrate gels or energy bars. Fats are much higher in calories, so to get the calories in, having some fat in your diet is good. And also because most ultra endurance events are quite low intensity, eating fat doesn't really cause a detriment to the way you can process the food, the speed you can process the food and get to your muscles and other energy systems that you need. So there isn't really a strong penalty to eating fat, and if you do eat fat, you're getting more calories in more easily, and therefore you're maintaining that energy balance much more effectively. And then of course in any event, you're doing some damage to your muscles, so you end up with some severe muscle damage at the end of an ultra endurance event, and studies have shown that, research shows that. So eating some protein to try and repair the muscles as you go seems like a reasonable approach. I haven't found anything in the literature to support that, but logically speaking, and because you're sustaining life as you get to longer events, you've got to support your normal life systems. You're not just trying to support yourself to survive till the end of 10 hours or a couple of days. But studies do show that more than 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day isn't of extra use, it's not of benefit. So for me, I'm 75 kilos, and I guess that's a fairly typical weight for an endurance cyclist. Then that's 150 grams of protein per day. Well, I'm vegan also, which makes it more difficult. So, the odds are stacked against me. But if I were to eat 6,000 calories a day of mixed foods that are predominantly carbohydrate, typical on-the-road type foods that I might pick up at gas stations, petrol stations, service stations, corner shops, or even supermarkets, then I would probably get roundabout, getting on for, or maybe a bit more than 150 grams of protein per day in that 6,000 calories, just by the virtue of the fact that the mix of macronutrients in all the food would add up to that. Because 150 grams of protein is about 10% of the 6,000 calories that I would need to be eating to maintain the energy balance. Say white bread is 13% protein. So the protein side of things should naturally happen. It naturally sorts itself out. Fat's really useful because it's got more calories in it. And then finally, of course, you need to have a mixture of foods because your body can only absorb up to 60 grams of carbs per hour from a single source. So if you get some fruit in stuff, or just dried fruit and stuff like that, then you get in a mixture of sugars, and as a consequence your body's much better at absorbing carbohydrates in that way. So I hope that's helpful, and it's a lot of information, and it might seem a bit waffly, but the conclusion is gels are the perfect food for shorter events, maybe up to a day, if you can train yourself to absorb them and digest them without too much distress. And once you get beyond that, then maybe having a few caffeine gels to get you through a bad patch would be good, but eating a mixture of foods to make sure you try and get as close as possible to that calorie balance, the energy balance, and also get yourself a bit of protein into your system. I'd love to hear what you do, what works for you, what have you tested, and if you can point me to any scientific literature that justifies some of the things we've talking about here, that would be really useful for me. And I'll obviously share it with everybody, and we're all learning from each other. Hopefully it's useful, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.